Banks don't get robbed the way we imagine. There is no moment where alarms scream and masked men run through marble halls. No single night that makes headlines and then ends, because the largest bank robbery in modern history unfolded quietly, invisibly, while the world slept, worked, and trusted its financial systems to behave exactly as they always had. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, more than $1 billion had already moved through official channels, approved by legitimate systems, processed by trusted software, and acknowledged by institutions that never once suspected they were obeying criminals. And this is where the story truly begins, not with a hack, but with trust, because modern banking is not built on walls or vaults. It is built on assumptions. Assumptions that systems will behave as programmed, that credentials equal identity, that internal traffic is safer than external threats, and that complexity itself acts as protection. But over the past decade, a new kind of criminal learned how to live inside that complexity without disturbing it, understanding that the safest place to hide is not outside the system trying to break in, but deep inside it, behaving so normally that no one thinks to question you, and understand how hackers stole $1 billion from banks without triggering alarms. You have to understand how banks actually work behind the polished apps and reassuring marketing. Because beneath the surface, global finance is a patchwork of legacy systems written decades apart, stitched together by interfaces that few people fully understand anymore, relying on batch processes that reconcile hours later, third-party vendors that operate with privileged access, and internal workflows designed for speed rather than suspicion. And hackers didn't discover this overnight. They studied it patiently, often starting far away from the banks themselves by targeting small companies that provided software updates, customer support tools, ATM maintenance services, or compliance reporting, knowing that these vendors had deep access but weaker defenses. And once a single vendor account was compromised, attackers gained an entry point that looked completely legitimate. An entry point that didn't trip alarms because it was supposed to be there, and from that moment on, the operation stopped looking like a crime and started looking like routine business activity, as attackers logged in, observed, learned, and waited, mapping internal systems not to break them, but to understand their rhythms, watching how transactions were approved, how limits were enforced, how alerts were generated and cleared, how employees interacted with dashboards they trusted more than their own instincts, and over time a disturbing realization emerged. Most fraud detection systems are not designed to detect malicious intent. They are designed to detect deviation, meaning that if someone behaves exactly as the system expects, the system will protect them, not stop them, and hackers adapted their behavior accordingly, moving slowly, carefully, slicing large sums into countless small transfers that blended into daily transaction noise, timing operations to coincide with peak processing hours, and routing funds through legitimate channels that assumed upstream verification had already occurred. And when discrepancies eventually appeared, they were often dismissed as reconciliation delays, accounting errors, or routine mismatches that would resolve themselves by the next cycle. Because banks process so much money every day that small inconsistencies are not alarming. They are expected, and that expectation became a weapon, because confidence in automation creates blind spots where no one looks too closely. And as weeks turned into months, attackers escalated their access not by force but by familiarity, requesting additional permissions using compromised credentials in ways that mirrored normal internal promotions or role changes, sometimes passing automated compliance checks because the requests followed established patterns. And in several confirmed cases, investigators later discovered that hackers had obtained the same operational authority as senior banking staff without triggering a single warning, effectively becoming invisible employees whose commands carried full legitimacy. And from that position, the theft accelerated, not in dramatic bursts, but in disciplined routines, as ATMs dispensed cash to coordinated mule networks on precise schedules. Internal ledgers were subtly altered before reconciliation processes ran. International transfers moved through correspondent banks that trusted the originating institution, and payment messages flowed through global financial networks designed for cooperation, not suspicion. At every step, the systems did exactly what they were built to do: execute instructions efficiently, silently, and at scale, while human operators saw nothing more than another busy day of transactions scrolling past their screens. And even when alerts fired, they were buried under thousands of false positives that staff had been trained to clear quickly, reinforcing a culture where speed mattered more than doubt. And hackers understood this culture intimately. designing their activity to sit just below thresholds, just inside tolerances, just familiar enough to avoid scrutiny, and the longer they remained undetected, the more confident they became, expanding operations across regions, currencies, and institutions, exploiting the fact that global banking never sleeps, but human oversight always does, coordinating actions across time zones so no single team ever saw the full picture. And when law enforcement finally pieced together these operations, they realized something deeply unsettling. The attackers had not defeated banking security, they had mastered banking operations, understanding not just how systems worked, but how people trusted them to work. And that realization forces an uncomfortable question. Because if the system cannot distinguish between a legitimate employee and an attacker who behaves like one, then the boundary between security and compromise no longer exists where we think it does. And what was stolen was not just money, but certainty. The certainty that our most critical financial infrastructure is under human control, and as banks quietly absorb losses, reimburse accounts, and rewrote internal reports to avoid public panic, the story remained fragmented across indictments, sealed investigations, and technical summaries few outsiders ever read. But the pattern was clear. Attackers did not outrun security. They walked alongside it patiently, invisibly, until the system itself helped them steal. And this is only the beginning. Because once hackers proved that banks could be manipulated from the inside without breaking encryption or triggering alarms, a new era of financial crime quietly began, one where the greatest threat is not a breach, but a trusted process doing exactly what it was designed to do for the wrong person. And in the next part, the story goes deeper into how specific tools like global payment networks, ATM controllers, and internal reconciliation systems were turned into weapons, revealing why even today, banks still struggle to answer the most dangerous question of all. How do you stop an enemy who looks exactly like you? They didn't need to steal passwords anymore, because by the time the second phase began, the system itself was already working for them. And that is the part most people never understand about how this billion-dollar theft actually scaled. Because once hackers proved they could exist inside banking infrastructure without being questioned, the challenge stopped being access and became optimization, figuring out how to move as much money as possible without changing the system's emotional temperature, without creating panic, without forcing anyone to look too closely. And that meant understanding the hidden plumbing of global finance at a level even many bank employees never reach. Because banks don't move money directly from point A to point B, they send instructions, confirmations, acknowledgments, reversals, retries, and settlements through layers of internal ledgers and external networks that were designed decades apart. And hackers learn to exploit the gaps between those layers, especially the moments when no single system has a complete picture of what is happening. One of the most critical being international payment messaging, where banks rely on trusted communication networks to tell each other what has already been verified upstream, meaning that once a transaction is framed as legitimate at the source, every institution downstream assumes the hard work has already been done. And attackers abuse this assumption by generating payment messages that looked exactly like high-volume corporate transfers, splitting massive sums into streams that matched normal business behavior, routing them through correspondent banks that handled thousands of similar messages every hour, knowing that speed and volume are the enemy of scrutiny. And when funds landed in intermediary accounts, they didn't disappear immediately. They rested, sometimes for days, blending into balances that fluctuated constantly, giving attackers time to assess whether any alarms had triggered before proceeding further. And this patience is what made the theft so devastating, because it allowed criminals to treat money movement like a controlled experiment, adjusting amounts, timing, and destinations until they found patterns that produced no response. And once those patterns were confirmed, they scaled them aggressively, coordinating withdrawals through ATM networks where machines were reprogrammed to dispense cash at specific times to specific cards controlled by mule networks spread across cities and countries, overwhelming local monitoring while staying invisible at the central level. Because from the bank's perspective, these were simply many small withdrawals happening exactly the way withdrawals always happen. And at the same time, attackers manipulated internal ledger systems, altering balances just long enough to pass reconciliation cycles before reverting them, exploiting the fact that many banks still rely on overnight or end-of-day batch processes to catch discrepancies, processes that assume honesty within the system, not active deception. And when investigators later reconstructed these events, They found transactions that technically balanced on paper even though real money had already left the building, creating a phantom equilibrium that delayed detection long enough for losses to become irreversible. And what made this possible was not a single vulnerability, but a chain of reasonable design decisions, each made in isolation to improve efficiency, reduce friction, or cut costs, decisions that together created blind spots no one owned, because responsibility was fragmented across departments, vendors, and jurisdictions, and hackers understood this fragmentation intimately, targeting systems that sat at the boundaries between teams, where everyone assumed someone else was watching. And this is where internal controls failed most spectacularly, because approvals that required multiple signatures were automated for speed. Exception handling was delegated to junior staff under pressure to clear queues quickly, and audit logs were reviewed after the fact rather than in real time, turning oversight into archaeology. And when red flags finally appeared, they often lacked context, showing numbers without narrative, alerts without explanation, making it easy for busy teams to rationalize them away as noise. And even when suspicions grew strong enough to warrant investigation, banks faced another problem. Proving something was wrong required shutting down systems that processed billions daily, a step few institutions were willing to take without absolute certainty, and attackers exploited this hesitation, knowing that as long as the system appeared functional, banks would prioritize continuity over confrontation. And so the theft continued, spreading across institutions that never realized they were part of the same campaign, because each saw only a fragment, a loss here, a discrepancy there, never the full pattern. And when law enforcement eventually connected the dots, they discovered that the same techniques have been reused with minor variations across continents, targeting banks with different software stacks, but similar operational assumptions, proving that the weakness was not technological but structural, embedded in how modern finance balances trust and speed. And this realization triggered quiet changes inside the industry. Tighter controls, more monitoring, more audits, but also more complexity, because every new safeguard added friction that banks feared would slow business or frustrate customers, creating a constant tension between security and competitiveness that attackers continue to exploit. And what makes this story truly unsettling is that none of these methods are secret anymore. They are documented in indictments, postmortems, and internal reports, yet the underlying conditions remain largely unchanged. Because global banking still depends on trust between systems that cannot fully verify each other in real time, still relies on human operators, trained to resolve problems quickly rather than question fundamentals, and still operates at scale where small percentages translate into enormous sums, meaning that even marginal success for attackers can produce catastrophic losses. And as digital banking expands, automation deepens, and artificial intelligence begins to make decisions once reserved for humans, the line between legitimate and malicious behavior becomes even harder to draw, raising a question that banks are increasingly uncomfortable confronting. Because if attackers can train their behavior to satisfy every rule, pass every check, and trigger no alerts, then security stops being about building stronger walls and becomes a problem of philosophy, of deciding when to distrust the very processes that make modern finance possible. And that is the uncomfortable truth behind $1 billion that vanished, because it was not stolen in defiance of the system. It was stolen with its full cooperation, and unless that contradiction is resolved, the next theft will not need new techniques, only more time, more patience, and a system still confident that what looks legitimate must be safe, a confidence that history has already proven can be very expensive.